Good evening. On behalf of Florida International University, I welcome you. I am Jorge Duani. I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute here at FIU. The institute is devoted to create and disseminate knowledge about Cuba and its diaspora. We sponsor research and teaching in many disciplines. We organize extracurricular activities like tonight's, and we cooperate with other academic units interested in Cuban studies or Cuban American studies. We also support the development of bibliographic resources. Tonight, as you know, we have a very special guest, but before we receive her, I want to make a few announcements. We want this event to be an open conversation between the public, members of the student body, of the faculty, and the community in general, as well as our guest. In order to have this dialogue, it is important for all of us to observe certain courtesy rules. First of all, I want you to turn off or silence your cellular phones. Secondly, when we get to the question and answer session, people who want to participate should raise their hands, and once you recognize, please go to the nearest hall, whether it's the first floor or the second floor, and a voluntary will bring a mic to you. The person with the mic, only that person will be able to make the questions. We will not allow interruptions. Please limit yourself to one concise question so that we have enough time for others to participate. When you are recognized, please say your name, whether you are a student or a faculty member or a member of the community. Once you make your question, please have a seat. In order to facilitate the discussion, we will group the questions 2 or 3 at a time. People who do not observe these rules are going to be asked to leave the hall. This is going to be broadcasted live through Univision America and channels throughout the country. Also, we are webcasting it. If you want to participate in Instagram, use hashtag FIU Yoani. I also want to announce that this event is going to be broadcasted here on Channel 3 for the English interpretation in your receivers. The commitment of Florida International University with freedom of speech is based on the academic tradition of the United States, which supports the expression of multiple points of view, as well as in the U.S. Constitution that protects freedom of speech without fear of reprisals. At FIU, we understand that this is a universal human right, and we have worked for decades throughout our teaching and research programs to disseminate the concepts of liberty and freedom of the press and freedom of speech in many countries throughout Latin America, including Cuba. Keeping that in mind, tonight we receive at FIU with very gladly an independent journalist from Cuba who has refused to lose her right to express herself freely, and I present you Yoani Sanchez. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to present you one of the founders of the Cuban Research Institute and the 5th president of Florida International University, Dr. Mark Rosenberg. Thank you, Dr. Duani. Good evening. On behalf of FIU, it is a great pleasure to welcome you, both those who are here at the Wertheim Performing Arts Center, as well as all of those who are following us through Univision America, internet, social media, Twitter, Instagram. I also want to welcome our elected officials. First, We have the chair of the Board of Trustees of the FIU Foundation, Mr. Albert Maury. At the same time, I would like to present other members of our board, Clyde de la Vega, Claudia Puig, and Lara Fariñas. Thank you very much. We are pleased to welcome very cordially the Honorable Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart, Honorable Congressman Joe Garcia, to the ex-Congressman Lincoln Diaz-Balart, and to Commissioner Jose Pepe Diaz, and an alumnus and a commissioner, Esteban Bobos. Ladies and gentlemen, Yoani Sanchez was born in Havana, Cuba in 1975. She studied Hispanic letters, but due to economic reasons, she devoted herself to teaching Spanish to tourists who came to visit her country. In 2002, she was disenchanted, and that led her to emigrate to Switzerland. But due to family reasons and against the counsel of friends, she returned to her country in 2004. That same year, she founded, together with a group of Cubans in the island, the Consenso Review of Debate. She worked also as a webmaster, an article writer of a portal that was broadcasted through internet from Cuba. In 2007, she founded the Generation Y blog, which she has defined as an exercise that allows me to say in this space what is forbidden for me to do and act out in the public sphere. Later, her blog was censored in Cuba from March 2008. Despite that fact, she was able to survive, and due to that work, she received the Ortega y Gasset Journalism Prize for digital journalism. Her blog was also selected by Time magazine and CNN among the 25 best blogs in the world. She also received the award from the Bitácoras.com Spanish media, and the first prize in the system called the Bobs, with more than 12,000 participants throughout the world. The weekly journal of El País called her one of the 100 most notable Hispanics in the year, and one of the 10 most important intellectuals of that year. In January, Yoani was able to get a passport after years of the Cuban government denying her permission to travel abroad. Since February, she has been in an international tour carrying her message to places including Brazil, the Czech Republic, Mexico, and the United States, where she has visited New York and Washington, D.C. And now And now we have her with us, finally, in the heart of the Cuban exile community. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, I would like to present an award from our university to Yoani Sanchez, the Medallion of Courage. The first time in the history of this university that we present this medallion, and we do so to Yoani Sanchez. And I would also like to ask the chair of our board, Dr. Mauri, and Dr. Duauni, to help me out with this presentation. Yoani Maria Sanchez Cordero, a renowned journalist, we applaud her eloquent act of resistance that have given hope to the people of her native land and inspired the praise of an attentive world. With the truth and the power of the spoken word, you have defied the forces of repression. With the real truth and the power of the word, you have evaded the repression of the creative spirit and of the human spirit in response to a regime that for decades has forced into exile to many of their most brilliant intellectuals. Nevertheless, you have decided to live in the land of your forefathers against an authority that crushes those who dare to think by themselves. You overcame, and in rebelliousness against a power that still resorts to violence and threats against those who speak frankly, you have been able to find your own strength, your own voice, and thereby inspire the people of your country to hope for a better future. In recognition to her vital role in the struggle for human dignity and liberty, which have moved many hearts in South Florida, including ours, and by the power invested in me by the Board of Trustees of my university, I present to you this Medallion of Courage. Now we have the privilege to ask the Honorable Commissioner Jose Pepe Diaz, who's going to present a certificate to Yoani on behalf of our county.
Good evening. Good evening, Hansa. It is a great pleasure for me to represent the great government of Miami-Dade County, to be here in order to give you, first of all, a Distinguished Visitor Award as a distinguished visitor of our community, which is so important for the mayor, the president of our council, Mayor Jimenez, and the President of the Council, Mrs. Sosa, and everyone else who's representing the community. We wish to honor you. I have several things for you, but I wish to give you this, and on behalf of the 2.6 million people who make up Miami-Dade County, and some of them are here, as I can see, I wish to present to you this Distinguished Visitors Award. And there is something very important that's given to people who are deserving in our community. As an exile, as a Cuban refugee, for me this is extremely important to see the courage of a person like you have shown, and what you have done increases this feeling. All these citizens who are before us, this does not open the treasury of the community, but it is the key to our hearts. And this is the key to the county that I want to present to you. Thank you very much. And finally, and this is extremely personal, I was a sergeant of Marines in this country, and courage for me is extremely important. And this is important for me because there is a medal that I received at a time in my life when it was very important. But when I see a person who has greater courage than many men and people I know, it is important to me to give you this medal. This is on my own behalf and that of my family.
Well, thank you so much for all of you for being here. I'm very excited and moved by all of this, not only because of the awards and the gifts, but I am also excited about the people who are here, the hugs, the words of strength, of hope, the concerns that many of you have shown regarding my return and my life in Cuba. Thank you very much for all of that. And thank you for those who organized this such a beautiful event here in an academic environment where I'm also a part of. I come a little bit from the Cuban Academy, even though I'm an academic renegade. And that's because the academics in Cuba is full of very much too close to the power there, and that's why I am a renegade. When the academia returns to be the voice of the people, I will return to academia. I promise it. Now, I'm here, they've asked me to talk about technology, but more than that, I'm going to start with a story, a testimonial that mixes technology, pain, and life. It is a story that begins at the end of 2012 when a terrible hurricane, Sandy, destroyed the eastern part of Cuba. It went right through the Santiago de Cuba province in a horrible dawn for many families, destroyed roofs, houses in an instant, left families on the streets, killed people. A hurricane that affected an area that was already devastated by the years, by the suffering, by the lack and material uh, miseries. And I'm telling you that because that day when we woke up, inclusive, those communities that had not suffered the Hurricane Sandy, we said, what are we going to do with all those people who were left with nothing? Those people who had very little and had lost what little they had. And I remember my phone began to ring. Friends started calling each other, and we said, what are we going to do? The eastern part of the country was incommunicated. There was no way to know the extent of the damages. And with our cell phones, we started texting to the different provinces of the country. First of all, to know how extensive the damage had been, what people could tell us in their area, and where we could start moving our help and our solidarity. That day, by noon, we already had a label in Twitter, that social network that you know, and some of you will look at me wondering what it is. It's a social network that have allowed many young people in the world to raise their voices, and even other people who are not so young to say their opinion. It has played an important movement in various social and civic movements throughout the world in the last few years. With 140 characters in that social network, with that blue bird that protects us. That was the platform with which we began to claim, to reclaim, and to unite the efforts and the solidarity to help our compatriots on the eastern side of the country. It started as a label, just a few letters with the hashtag in front, and it said Solidarity with Oriente, the East. And we started sending it through our cell phones. They're pretty much autistic cell phones because they are not connected to the internet, because they belong to the only telephone network permitted in the country, which belongs to the government, and which applies censorship. So that when an activist denounces systematically through their cell phone or reports violations of human rights, well, this telephone network, which is nothing other than the technological arm of the government, it cuts your services, it eavesdrops, and it finds through the cell phone itself where the activist is located. But throughout all of those shadows and all of the problems of cellular phones in Cuba, those little gadgets have changed our lives. They have changed the dynamics of informatics in Cuba. And with those little cell phones, we started to spread the message to all the activists in the country with whom we have been able to connect. And we told them that we needed solidarity with Oriente, the oriental part of the island. At first it seemed like a bottle that you threw to the ocean with a piece of paper rolled up in it. And a few hours after Sandy, the messages that came in and out of Cuba that were worried, who not only use the cell phone to play or to gossip, but also to report what goes on in their country, many of those people were already using the phrase solidarity with Oriente. It was a short phrase, a couple of words only, but by the next day, those two words started bearing fruit. And the result was that our living room at our home was filled with solidarity with Oriente. People would knock on our door, and they would come with the most emotional things, clothing for babies, 3 kilos of sugar, half of their ration for the month. To give up half of their rice quota is an enormous sacrifice in Cuba, and many of you know that. So people would show up with small bags with a lot of things: medication, clothing, rice, sugar, candy, anything that was dehydrated that they could bring that was non-perishable. And our living room became filled with bags, cans, shoes, flashlights, and tablets to uh, clean the water. The living room of Antonio Rodiles, who's an activist who directs the Estado de Sacs project, many living rooms were filled with that solidarity with Oriente. And I tell you this story because it has a happy ending, and I like that. In less than 2 weeks, we had collected a ton and a half of help for Oriente from Cubans from within the island, people who had so little, just as little as those who had been affected by the hurricane. It was the first time that something like that was able to be made at that level. Usually, Cuban citizens wait for orders to come from the top down, when solidarity should be done, how it should be done, and for the first time we were able to articulate something so spontaneous, so much from the grassroots, that finally became real in objects and resources for those people who needed it. And it was the first help that arrived to the eastern side of the island. Thanks also to Father Jose Conrado, who soon will join us. Thank you to Father Jose Conrado from the Santa Teresita Church in Santiago de Cuba. That solidarity with Oriente went to the people who needed it and to those who were most forgotten and forlorn. And I tell you this story because sometimes we have the temptation to separate the virtual world from the real world, the Cuba of the kilobytes to the physical, material Cuba. Sometimes we fall into the temptation of saying, with the keyboards and the screens, we're not going to solve anything. And sometimes we believe that all those tweets, that all of those blogs, that all of those denunciations online and all the signatures that are asked for online, we think that that's all in cyberspace, actions in the virtual world. But no, my life is full of examples in the last 6 years that prove the opposite. The virtual Cuba is affecting the real Cuba directly. Every time they're closer. Even though we're the country in the Western Hemisphere that has the least internet connectivity, despite the fact that we're a nation where internet is practically a bad word, where the great fear that the government has is to open access to the people, to that great spider web throughout the world, full of lights and of shadows, because the internet reflects the human beings, therefore is full of both light and shadows. So when you live in a country where internet is practically the black beast, and where the government has a panic to open that space of that cyberspace, one could think that the virtual Cuba and the real Cuba are very far away and they cannot connect. Nevertheless, every day when you see the actions of activists and how internet has influenced the international community to listen after decades and decades where nobody listened to us, where nobody believed us, where nobody wanted to know what was happening. Now, the internet is helping us. It's helping us to explain to the world what is happening inside our country. And not only that, internet brings us news about ourselves, sometimes by chance, and sometimes it's hard for many of you to understand, where you open your computer and internet is right there, just at a click. Maybe it is difficult for you to understand how the internet works in Cuba, but it does work haphazardly. The news come out through our cell phones, through texts, through a call that the activist is able to do right before he or she is arrested, through a blog that we're able to post, and that, as a boomerang, goes out and returns to us in unimaginable ways. A relative who's exiled, who calls his family member in the island and says, I have heard about a house crumbling at a certain street. Do you know anything about it? And sometimes the person in Cuba finds out because somebody on the other side of the Florida Straits has found out that information and has brought it back into the island. And I'm telling you that because you're part of that rebound. You can make that boomerang to return. Otherwise, without you, it would be just bottles with messages thrown to the sea that never return. There are many, many examples. A few days ago, a reporter, Calixto Ramon Martinez, who's also an activist, after 6 months being detained, one of the men who showed shed light about the existence of cholera in Cuba, something that the government didn't want to be known because they want to show that Cuba is a paradise. The rest of the world is the inferno. So everything that affects that paradise, like an illness like cholera that comes from misery, it bothers the government. They don't want to soil the tourist face of Cuba. When Calixto Ramon said that there was cholera in Cuba, a few weeks later he was arrested. He had been in jail for more than 6 months without a fair trial. And after a big mobilization in Twitter, Facebook, blogs, even an online petition that had hundreds of signatures, Calixto Ramon declared himself in a hunger strike. And through international pressure asking for his liberation, they have just promised to free him. They have not done it yet, but there has been progress. And that has been not only because what has been done in the real Cuba, people who have raised their voices, who have gone to protest, who have gone to the police stations to find out what's going on with Calixto, but also because of the virtual Cuba, all the tweets, all the messages, all the kilobytes with the name Calixto Ramon that have gone through cyberspace. So I feel protected in a certain way because I think that many Cubans inside the island, activists, dissidents, independent journalists, alternative bloggers, there's many of us, luckily, we can be called by many names, we feel protected because of that shield that technology affords us. Imagine 15 or 20 years ago, what would have happened to our voices, to ourselves? The silence, nobody would have found out. Nobody would have known that Calixto Ramon was in jail without a fair trial. Nobody would have known that we needed, through organized citizenship, to compilate help and solidarity for Cuba's eastern side. So when they asked me to talk about technology and democracy, technology and liberty, I couldn't find better examples than these, because what is liberty and democracy but that which citizens demand and obtain and earn through their way of confronting power and demanding it from their governments? We are beginning it. It is a dangerous and slow process, but technology is helping us. It's helping us also because of the sacrifice of others who came before us, who didn't have a cell phone, who didn't have a blog, Twitter, or Facebook, who went through that stage where the long night of disinformation was casted over the island. But now we can continue that legacy with the new technological structures, the new gadgets that are helping us. And that is basically the story that I wanted to tell you, a story about life, about technology, about pain. Every democratic process of citizen expression has doses of pain, and if you're not willing to give that pain, to make that sacrifice, don't even attempt it. You can be a passive citizen. But if you want to act, then you have to know that in Cuba is a long and painful road, but it's a road that we no longer travel alone. We are many, and now we also have the company of technology. Thank you very much.
I am going to take down the questions because my mind is not that young anymore. Thank you, Yoani, for your magnificent speech. Now, let us remind you of the rules for the questions. You have to raise your hand. Once you are recognized, you go to the nearest aisle, and someone will hand you a microphone. There are 2 microphones on the front and 2 on the balcony. The person who is at the microphone has to ask the questions. No interruptions will be permitted. Everyone will make only 1 short question so as to give everyone a chance. We ask you to identify yourself, say your name, if you're a student, a faculty member, or someone from the community, and after asking the question, go back to your seat. We will group the questions together, 2 or 3 at one time. Someone who's back there first. Your name? There are more rules than a baseball game. Yeah. Maria Rosa Arcos, a community, from the community. There's a question back there in the microphone, or at the microphone. My question is if you think that Cuba will end up like China, a capitalist country, but without freedom. Yes, that's a danger.
But I think that's what the governments need to do, to establish a system where there are certain bubbles of economic freedom while they still have a strong hand politically. But there's a problem to create a model like that in Cuba. We lack the Chinese. We are not Chinese. Also, I think that the idea has arrived to them too late. Maybe in 1993, 94, when the then President Fidel Castro started some economic reforms, he would have continued that process. Perhaps we would have been trapped in a Chinese model, but they stopped those reforms. They want to now start again with the idea. Now it's too late. They're in the midnight, in the twilight of their lives, and they're not going to have time. I have that expectation and that hope that we will not have the Chinese jail.
Another question, Johnny Mario Vallejo, Univision. To what point, from your perspective, the foreign correspondents of different chains that exist in Cuba have become accomplices of misinformation in order not to lose their position in Cuba and have been replaced by independent journalists?
Well, you want to get me into trouble with a foreign journalist. Let me see how I can get out of this. Well, unfortunately, in the case of many of them, I don't want to generalize because I have met people who have lost their journalist visa, have been even expelled from the country because they wanted to do an honest and objective investigative journalism without any concessions to the regime. So I don't want to generalize. But in the case of some and many, sometimes they are the subject of pressure and privileges. It's no secret that foreign journalists have many privileges, certain permits than common citizens, we common citizens cannot have. And they pay for that with journalistic concessions, with silences. Now, what has happened? I think this is interesting, and it has to do with what I was mentioning before in my introduction. So I thank you very much for this question. What has happened? Well, there was a moment in which the civil society that was starting in Cuba needed the foreign correspondent to report the activities, the events of that civil society. So if you were a dissident, an activist, and you wanted to present a document or narrate the violation of your rights, you needed to call those foreign journalists and convince them that their story was worth being broadcast, and therefore the journalists would either come or not, and if they didn't come, then the news wouldn't come out and you wouldn't exist and nothing happened. That changed. A few weeks ago, we were in an activity, in an event, some independent journalists, bloggers, activists, and a foreign journalist came and said, hey, nobody told me. And I told her, we don't need you anymore. We have ourselves. We can narrate in the first person, which is something very important. Sometimes when I give Twitter courses to other activists and to citizens in general, I tell them, learn how to narrate yourself. When you narrate yourself, then the government can distort you, can narrate you, but you have already narrated yourself in the first person. And that has happened with the foreign correspondents. Now we narrate ourselves. We have the cell phones. We have very precarious uh, cameras and uh, patchy access to the internet, but we can do it. So now the competition is very strong for them.
Very well. Let's go over to this side. Is there any question on this side of the audience? Back there. Good evening. Thanks to FIU for the opportunity to be able to broadcast this to our chain. I've been listening to programs on the radio, Univision Radio, and I've been surprised by the photographs in your Twitter. You don't live badly. You have good books. You have a laptop. You have a comfortable home. We see pictures of people who live differently in Cuba. And besides that, I saw you with an iPhone, an intelligent phone. The Cuban cause, have you made it into a way of life, or is there any kind of special subvention that you are receiving?
Well, thank you for saying that I have a beautiful house. I have a Yugoslavian-style building that my husband built with his own hands. He used to live back then in a raft that he would inflate every night, and he would sleep on it under the table of a friend. He joined a building brigade. He worked for 5 years to be able to build and have that apartment. Yes, it is a beautiful apartment because it is full of freedom. It is full of plants and books. In that apartment, which bothers the government a lot because it's a totally legal apartment with it cost my husband not only 5 years of work, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week from Monday through Saturday. He wasn't able to carry out with his profession as a journalist, and then he had to pay for 20 years so that it could be his. It can be his property. That apartment is our infrastructure to be free and democratic. We invite our friends. It is full of light, of plants, of books. And it is what has allowed us to be who we are, because something that the Cuban government has done very skillfully is to leave the citizens without an infrastructure to stand upon to be free. Many people live with their parents or grandparents and cannot invite friends to their house. If we allow ourselves to be closed into that cycle that the government has put us in. I have not made activism into my profession, or I was a teacher. I taught language and Cuban culture to many foreigners. I lost my job in 2008 in that sector where pressure from the police did not allow me to continue. Now perhaps I would be able to do that, and I would be able to work for myself. So I got this. This is not a living. I see it as a sacrifice. I have no problem with prosperity. I think that in Cuba, prosperity should be decriminalized.
Let's go to the upper floor. Please come closer to the microphones. There's someone there. Yoani, good evening. My name is Fabio Gabriel Olaño, and I am a Colombian refugee who has been 14 years in Miami. My father, Jorge Olaño Muñoz, was a musician. all his life he wanted to go to Cuba. In the 70s, 80s, planes were kidnapped, hijacked into Cuba. He always wanted to visit Cuba. Recently, I left my country, city, Bogota, Colombia, and in my father's cassettes I found a Cuban danzón called Cubanita, and I bring it here for you. It is dedicated to you for your efforts and your love of freedom.
Thank you.
The audience and you will be kind enough to allow me to go to the stage so I can deliver it to you personally. No, it cannot be done that way. We will be happy to let her have it later. There were anecdotes that my father had of all the countries he had visited because of his copyright. Even at least, even if it is in a hijacked plane, I would like to go there, and I would be happy to go. Someone has been raising his hand for a while. Yes, thank you. Good evening, Yoani. My name is Manny Miranda. I am a student at FIU, and it gives me great satisfaction to know that in Cuba there are still Cubans with the mettle that you have. I would like you to comment about Cubans that visit Cuba. I know that this is important for you.
Thank you. As I said that this afternoon, I make this introduction because I think it's important. I'm a person who technology has changed her life, and also this work that I have mentioned to be able to earn a living independently as a city guide, as a Spanish teacher. I went more than 500 times in 14 years to the Museum of the Revolution. Imagine that. I also went to the Art Museum, which I did like. So independence, autonomy, economic autonomy became political autonomy. And I'm not saying that every Cuban would be able to have that, but I think that if people have concerns, I think that one thing will lead to another. And I say this because this helped me a lot. I'm talking about the tourism, not the tourism that comes looking for prostitution, for frivolity, that looks at Cuba through the hotel window, but a tourism that is more aware, a tourism that goes to help the people, who will give you as a present a smartphone like I have, which is my most prized possession, or a laptop. That tourism that tells you, here's a flash drive, here's a CD, here's a laptop that I cannot use and I'm leaving it with you. That changed my life. And that's why I insist that instead of cutting the roads and keep people from going, what we have to do is have people go who will help the people of Cuba. I don't know how to achieve this, but I imagine that maybe something can be done. I don't know whether to give a brochure in every tourist agency. If you go to Cuba, please help free one Cuban, at least one Cuban. With 2 million or more tourists a year, if half of them would make a commitment, I think that would accelerate the democratic transition in Cuba in a surprising way. So I'm not saying no to tourism, even though tourism has brought many negative things to my country. But I'm talking about a responsible, a civic tourism, tourism for freedom.
Another question over here. Yoani, my name is Pedro Freire. I am of the family of FIU and a member of the community. I'd like you to wear your poet's hat and give us a happy end toward the reunification of the Cuban nation, those who are here, those who are over there, to make us realize a magic vision of having Cuba reach democracy.
Well, first, to get to a poetic ending, you have to be also very practical. There are hard times to come. I don't want to alarm you, and I don't want to alarm myself more than necessary, but there are tough times ahead because the government, when the people who are in power, who have been in power for 54 years, they feel that they're losing their power. There's going to be a terrible repression, and now they have no shame to repress. At one time, they would hide the repression. Now they don't even have that shame. So it's going to be complicated because I see a movement in civil society that is going to cause the government and those in power to feel trapped. Now, every birth implies pain, and perhaps this is the poetic side, perhaps more maternal. Every birth is a rupture, is bleeding, contractions, pains, the sensation that you're dying, but you're being born. So there are difficult times ahead, but I know that in the national Cuban spirit will bring an inclusive country. I think that we live in a long and narrow island where we don't have, for example, any linguistic conflict. We all speak this beautiful language that is Spanish. We don't have this great regional conflicts. Sometimes in baseball, those from one province are rivals with another, but it doesn't cause a civil war. And we don't have any ethnic conflict. We're a great ethnicity. There's a lot of mixture of races, and even though I cannot say that racial discrimination has been eradicated in my country, because it has not, but I think that all those shades, all those rainbows of the different shades of skins that we see on the streets, it kind of softens the conflict. So since we don't have these great conflicts that affect the world, that provoke wars, then what is our conflict? Is it ideological? No, I don't believe so. I don't believe that ideology will do what all these other conflicts that are much more profound have not been able to do. So I think that that great human capital on both shores, this exhaustion with totalitarianism, that idea that you cannot hand the country over to one man, that you cannot write a blank check to one party, that you cannot give your fatherland to an ideology. That lesson, that learned lesson, which I hope we have learned and that we'll continue to learn for much time, I think that that will bring a prosperous Cuba, a Cuba where all Cubans will have a place.
Let us go back to the second floor. There's another question up there. Good evening. I'm Tom Donan. I am a member of the community in Miami, but someone who supports the Cuban Revolution. I would like to know your position concerning the 5 Cubans that have been in jail for 15 years, if they should be free or not.
Yes, that's another topic that there are tests. Cubans, we undergo a test everywhere we go. I'm going to tell you a story that also tells you about how exhausted we are in Cuba about that topic. And one time, my son came back from school and asked me whether the Cuban flag had a 5-point star, because those 5 points represented what they said in the school, the 5 heroes of the revolution. I thought it was a joke, but he really had a doubt. And at that time I understood the damage that that campaign has done in terms of its presence, in intensity, in cost. It costs my country, it costs the treasury of my country, and it costs my children as well to maintain that campaign. So my position is clear. I believe they have had all the legal opportunities in this country, in a country where there's a separation of powers. They have had every opportunity to demonstrate their supposed innocence. I believe they are guilty of Cubans as well having died. And they are also guilty that my son believes, like many other children in Cuba, that the five-pointed star refers to them.
Is there another question? Yoani, good evening. My name is Manuel Mani here in the exile community Piedra, and I am a great grandson of a general of the War of Independence, Miguel Piedra Marcel. I am not going to ask you a question. I am going to try. I gave you a book tonight called Faces, in which 300 people who have been executed by the regime that you know nothing about because you are very young. But I have read it. I have read it. There you have the faces, the dates, so that you will realize of what the historical exile is, what is our resentment, and why we no way can accept an amnesty with a regime that has killed, has executed, has kicked out, and you have been a mild kind of victim for that regime. Like Paquito de Rivera says, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I admire you because anything that goes against the regime is good. But please try to understand. I know these are two different generations. Try to understand what the pain is, our pain, who saw our brothers, our sons, our fathers who died, and we could not go see them, and they are buried in graves that have no name. Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Another question on this side here. Good evening, Yoani. My voice is not for a question. I wish to express my gratitude publicly for all the sacrifice and struggle that you're carrying out. This struggle that we were unable to carry out. May God go with you. Go ahead. We couldn't hear the question. I am sorry. No microphone. Let us go back and make the questions short because Yoani has another appointment at 9 o'clock. So a couple of questions up there. Good evening. My name is Ani Gallo. I came from Cuba when I was 8. I've been here for 46 years. I remember how frightened I was when you couldn't speak against the government. I would like to know what life is like for your children, for your family, and the daily threats that you find every day.
Well, when you have experienced that pain, I think that you can understand other pains. And not because I have not lived in prison or the physical loss of a family member, it doesn't mean that I cannot imagine what that feels like to some extent, because pain gets transferred, sorrow is inherited. The experience of repression is passed on from parents to children, even if you haven't experienced it in your own flesh. I came to another time to turn on the television and see my name being called cyber terrorist, enemy of the fatherland, where not only my son watches, but all his friends in school, all my friends, everybody who knows me. And I know that the next day I have to go out to the streets and walk through those streets where they have fomented the hatred against me. When people can tell me, no matter what I say, it doesn't matter. It came out on TV yesterday that you're an enemy. So I've experienced that. It's hard. My family has experienced it, and sometimes it's a pain that you cannot share with anyone because nobody wants to carry that cross. I have lost many friends, people who one day I never saw again, and I imagine that they were threatened. So I tell people that what I have suffered the most these past 6 years is not just the beatings or the arrests or the tooth I lost last time they beat me and I was arrested. That is not the most painful thing. The most painful thing is people to stop saying hello to me because of fear, not to come to my house because they're afraid to lose their jobs or to lose uh, possibilities. And the troubadours, the singers who would sing in my house or in the porch, sometimes with those songs of protest, they left and they never came back because they were afraid they would lose the opportunity to sing in a stage in a public place. With my family also, because that's what is most painful, because sometimes they pressure me very much, but I like I said, I have the fortune of having a very close-knit family that has supported me, that does not complain, that has suffered, but they have never will tell me, I told you so, why did you get into this, like many people have said.
One more question, please. Hello, Yoani. My name is Eliana Rodriguez. I'm in a wheelchair. I can't walk. I went into a wheelchair in Cuba. When you're in a wheelchair, I was 13, you become an individual of the fourth or fifth or sixth kinds. I am shocked because I was in Cuba after I came to the United States. I went to visit my family and I realized that young people have no hope of any kind, and my young friends that I grew up with have no hope. All they think about is sitting in the front porch. And I'm asking you, what can be done for these young people, those who have to get around in a wheelchair and they don't have a family like I did to convince them that they can get farther than that? And this is a complex situation. I wonder how from here, being young, I can help young people over there who are in a similar situation.
Yes, the loss of hope, the loss of a horizon, that a better tomorrow is possible, that type of hope that every human being should maintain in order to survive any situation, that loss is one of the most serious anthropological damages that Castroism has left us. All of those young people who waste their times on the streets and the porch, sometimes drinking to forget their sorrows or to numb themselves and not to think about the situation or not to get in trouble. Sometimes they prefer to get into their personal bubble, into their shell, and that's very sad because that's one of the worst legacies of this system in which we live. But I think that you can wake up out of apathy and hopelessness. I woke up, and you can come out of there with some hope. How to do it? Well, I had to live through many dramatic situations, but also many people gave me their hope. They passed their hope to me. So I think that we need to pass our hope to others with information, knowing that the world exists outside with some freedoms that can one day come to your own country, to know that life does not end, like for example with Cuban mothers, that life does not end when you become a mother and then you end up cooking for the whole family, looking for food, struggling with a economic schizophrenia that we live in, and to transmit hope, to transmit information, and to try to empower. I insist on the citizens' empowerment and the technological and material empowerment, on the empowerment of hope, if you could call it so. Today somebody told me, let's send remittances of information, remittances of getting ahead of overcoming, of energy. They don't have to always be money or soup cubes. It can be hope. And how do you transmit it? Well, when you meet somebody face to face is the best way to help them. What do you need? What are your dreams? I saw a Soviet movie a long time ago, and there was a scene that has a lot to do with your question. It was a very poor kid and a friend with more resources. He had a coat, and he asked his friend, "What are your dreams?" He said, "My dream is to have a coat like yours." And then the one with the coat gave him his, and it says, "Here you go, so that you can have higher hopes." Let's help Cubans to have higher hopes.
Yoani has been very generous with her time, but she has to go to another event. Let's give her one last opportunity to say something.
Well, I have felt among family in many ways, because that's how families are. And one side of the table they say one thing, and another side of the table they say something else. We never agree, but we all love each other. We do the family photos, we share the bread, we put water on the soup, and everybody gets to have some soup. So I felt among family in many ways. Thank you. Thank you for the support and for reminding this little Cuban girl her true place, the true place of a citizen, which is like an ant in an anthill. Each one has its role. Mine is in technology, in the press. There are other people who have very important roles also. So let's not disqualify any of those roles. The national anthill needs them all. Thank you very much. This is a heavy medallion. Thank you. Thank you. I love you. Thank you.